All right, so we're going to get started on the panel Aging Characters Through Series. That is what I'm in, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so I've been elected moderator, apparently. So I'm going to start with having each of the panelists introduce themselves briefly, and I will start, and as to why we're on this panel. So I'm Hayden Trenholm. I'm a writer, editor. I'm the publisher of Bundoran Press, science fiction press. We've had a number of books where there are series. I'm also an avid reader, particularly of mystery series, so I do have some opinions about whether characters should age or be ageless. So that's me.
My name is Jennifer Estep. I write several different fantasy series, and I'm here because I have a book series that has 16 books in it, so my character has aged a little bit over the course of that series.
Hi, I'm Susan Calder, and I have a mystery series that I'm writing. I've published the first 2 books already, and I'm here because I originally wanted my character to age in real time, but it didn't quite work out that way.
My name is Sandra. I publish as S.G. Wong, and I write a series of hard-boiled detective novels with ghosts and magic, and it's set in an alternate 1930s Chinese LA. And so I have a series protagonist, and I've also grappled with how quickly to age her or not.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to start off by getting each of the panelists to talk a little bit about what are the benefits and negatives of aging a character or keeping them the same age. Why do you choose to do it the way you do it? Either age them more slowly than time actually passes, or age them entirely in real time, or not age them at all. Why do you make that choice, and what are the benefits to that choice?
Well, with my Elemental Assassin series, the first book was published in 2010, and now 7 years later. So if I had aged her in real time, it would be, so many things would have happened, even more than happened on the books already. So what I usually do is the start of a new book, it's a new month, because that way I can keep track of the timeline in my own head. 16 books is 16 months. So it's pretty easy for me to do the math and how old is she and that sort of thing. But some of the negatives are there's a romance in the series, and I get a lot of questions like, why aren't they engaged yet? Why aren't they married yet? And I'm like, in book time, only about less than 2 years has passed, but in real life, it's been 7 years. So that's kind of one of the negatives. They really haven't been together that long, even though it feels like you've been reading the series forever at this point.
May I ask, Jennifer, was that a conscious decision, a month at a book a month, or a month a book?
Not really at the beginning, but then, when I got 3 or 4 books in, I thought, okay, it needs to have a little bit of a timeline progression, but I don't want to do years and years at a time.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I originally liked the idea of my protagonist aging in real time, because to me it just seems more like real life, and she would seem more like a real person. So that's what I wanted to do. But the thing is, I started the first book, I think it was 2004. It took me a few years to write it, a few more years to get a publisher. And so she was a certain age in that book. She was actually 52. And then I wrote the second book, and that took, again, longer to get the publisher. And if I'd wanted to make it right contemporary, she would have been about 65, by the second book. And it's a rather large gap in her lifetime that I felt, and I didn't quite want her to be that age. So I had thought, well, I guess I could set it back in 2005 again, but then it's kind of historical. And my publisher just said, just set it today and have her age 10 months and no one will notice. And so far, nobody has noticed who's read both of the books. It's a little bit weird if you read them, I would think, but nobody's commented on it yet. So I guess it works.
I think one of the best things about aging series characters that you get to explore their personality, and how do things change, how do they make their choices differently at a different age. Having said that, well, and then also before I go on to negatives, for example, with mine, because it's hard-boiled, really bad, tough things happen and really tough choices occur to my protagonist. Lola Stark is her name. So traumatic things happen to her, and I want to explore the aftermath of that trauma. So for me, fast forwarding a year didn't make sense. So I only have like a couple months at a time, and it's just the way that it worked out. I think one of the negatives that I encountered that I think Susan's already touched on is publication time and real world time versus book time. Sometimes, oftentimes, all the time, I'm saying time a lot, all the time, it is a vast difference between the two. So I think it can be very hard to keep track if you don't have some set system like the way Jennifer does, which is really smart. I'd never thought of that, actually. I think that's the biggest negative, is making sure everything's consistent in book world. And, and if you're going back to 2005, just think of how many technologies have changed in the 12 years. And, like Kinsey Milhone and Sue Grafton's series, amazing that she's got to remember everything from the 80s for Kinsey.
Well, there's your research, I guess.
Yeah, I guess.
You have to do your research, but you are, as you say, how big was a cell phone then? You have to actually almost probably look it up. And so that, which way you want it.
Exactly, yeah. And every bit of research you do takes away from writing time, so.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this question for me is that, this is very heavily a genre question. It doesn't happen very much in mainstream or literary fiction. The exception maybe being John Updike's Rabbit series, okay? So, and in that case, so I'll use that as a case where Rabbit ages considerably between books. I mean,
it's about 10 years between books.
That's
and
right.
I think he maybe published them about that.
That's right. But the character ages, and so you see
Right.
them differently. In genre, the only example I can think of where a character aged in real time is Travis McGee. Where when Travis McGee, John McDonald's mystery series begins, Travis is a young guy. He's around 30. By the time it ends, he's in his 60s. And the consequence, of course, is that what Travis can do in the last book and what Travis can do in the first book is radically different. And anyone who's aged 30-some years can tell you that. And I think the advantage for that series was that, and the disadvantage for the readers is you get to watch some of your favorite characters die. Which, if you don't age in real time, then death is only by murder, not by gradual decay.
Yeah. Actually, Edmonton author Janice MacDonald, no relation. Her series is the Randy Craig series, and Randy is the titular character. She ages just about every year for a year in the book. So, and I know Janice has made that a conscious choice because she's exploring the personality and the character of that person who's in her late 30s, mid 30s to late 30s, and her relationships and the choices she makes. So that's a good example too.
Does she set her books like in the past, like 2007, or like that?
No, I think she started publishing in the mid or late 90s.
She had a huge gap between some of.
So she sets them in the present as she's writing them, I believe. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that all you guys had mentioned mystery books instead of necessarily fantasy books.
Yeah.
And I was sitting here thinking, well, the V.I. Warshawski, I can never say her name right, by Sarah Paretsky. That's another one. I don't remember how much she ages, but she's been writing that series, I think, for like 20 years now.
Like 30 years.
But I just think it's interesting that we were talking more about the mystery books than, say, like fantasy or romance or something else. Maybe that's because, like, in fantasy books, a lot of people die at the end and they never age, like, George Martin's books.
Exactly.
I don't know.
It's more because probably we write that. We're maybe not as familiar. So you do input fantasy, what happens there, I think. It's, for all those kind of series, I would say. I think nowadays people readers tend to like to follow the progression of the character's life, right? And so you do need, you often want that aging because maybe the person gets married or divorced or has children or somebody dies, and people like that progression. So you like an aging, but how you do it, whether it's in real time or not real, or some kind of weird real time, is a question about it.
Actually, a question came up while you were saying that, Susan, is, so if you are aging them in real time, so to speak, then does that mean you feel the need as an author to put in more of those personal details? Because if you're going wham, bam, action, plot, and there's not a lot of aging from one book to another, do you feel maybe less of a need to talk about marriage or et cetera, et cetera?
Maybe it depends on the type of book you're writing. If you are writing more of an action, wham, bam type book, maybe you don't feel
Not
that
that
means.
there's anything wrong with Wham
No,
Bam.
nothing
at
wrong with
all.
Wham Bam.
Not at all.
Whatever.
Yeah.
But
As long
I
as you're
guess
polite
I
about
like,
it.
I'm interested in the personal story, so I want that to be part of it. So
Yeah.
I guess that's why I would tend to think of the aging.
Yeah.
You do have ones like Donna Leon. I don't know if people have read her books, but I don't think there's any really change in that character's life,
Yeah.
really through the series. Like, there is development and
Mhm.
things happen,
But-
but his kids are always teenagers, and nothing changes much in his life, although there's things that should impact him as a
I
as a
think
person.
the most extreme version of non-aging characters is Nero Wolfe, where Nero and Archie do not age and change one bit, while the world changes around them.
Mhm.
So literally, the story starts out, it's the 1930s, and Nero and Archie are living in this house together, and they never get any older, but gradually, at the end of the books, it's in the 1970s, and they're dealing with issues of the 1970s, but they have not aged a day, which is a kind of bizarre approach. And I'm not sure anyone else could get away with it except Rex Stout. But
Yeah.
Well, I would say too, like comic book characters, like Captain America was, supposedly born in like the 1920s or whatever, but because of magic super soldier serum,
And freezing.
and freezing and all this other stuff, he's the same. But even the characters that were like introduced in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, like Black Widow and Iron Man or whatever, in today's comics, they are still about kind of the same age because they want to keep selling those books and those stories. It's just it's kind of interesting.
yes, but they should think about it again with the success of Logan,
Yes.
which is, I thought was the best movie. Wonder Woman was very good. Logan was better.
See, I feel like I'm the only person who didn't like Wonder Woman.
No, you are not the only one who didn't like
But I
Wonder
think-
Woman. That's a different panel.
But I think this idea of aging your character is a more modern, like your traditional mysteries, Agatha Christie's,
I was just thinking.
Hercule
yeah.
Poirot, and
Miss
Miss Marple
Marple.
didn't really age until
Well,
I
Miss
guess
Marple
he died.
couldn't age. She would die.
Yeah, she was already
Die.
there. Yeah,
She
that's
was
true.
old.
Yeah, but they didn't think about that, and even if she didn't bring in current events too
Yeah.
much, that was just the idea. But I think it's a more modern idea of
Although,
getting more
although
engaged.
Poirot does die in
He
the
does
last book
until
of
he
old age,
dies,
yeah,
yes,
old age.
but he never gets married.
Spoiler,
and-
sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But
Oh,
other
sorry.
things don't happen until he actually does die. I was just going to say a problematic thing is if you have a police detective, back to mysteries, is that, don't forget, they tend to retire at a not an ancient age. And so I think Ian Rankin has said he ran into this problem that if he'd known that his series was going to go on for, 20 books or whatever, he might have made his character younger because as they age, they would really logically retire. And I think he did retire his Rebus character. But you have to think about that if you're using a police detective, and he's going to be reaching retirement age if you put him too much in real time, if your series is going to be a long-standing series.
Sorry.
No, I'm just saying something to think
Yeah.
about.
At the same time, American author, I think it's John Verdun, his main character is a retired NYPD detective, and he doesn't know what to do with himself because now he's retired.
Right.
So you could age them
Yeah.
into that, if even if they're a
Yeah, he
cop.
can live to 100 and still do that. Yeah.
It's- yeah. I guess the other issue is, do we sometimes maintain the age of characters because we think or know that that's what the readers want? That that especially when this is mostly, as I say, fantasy and mystery kind of issue, and I think a lot of people who read fantasy and mystery and science fiction too, I guess, don't necessarily want to be reminded of the grind of daily life. They don't necessarily want to see people with arthritis and memory loss and all of these things. They really read the stories because they want to go into a world and experience this kind of superior intellect, superior ability, superior joie de vivre. And so maybe that's why in a lot of cases we don't age our characters as much as real life does, because we know the readers actually want to escape from real life. Do you think that's a factor?
It could be in a lot of them. Some of them do that though. Like I think Henning Mankel's character, he developed diabetes and illnesses and is pretty much dying by the last book. And I guess he had maybe a time frame on his series in that. So I think there are some that really do want to get into sort of the real problems of the characters and will do that. But maybe it depends more on the type of mystery you're writing. I guess that's an answer.
I think it kind of has to do with the genre too, because when you're reading a mystery, the mystery is the main focus. You have a crime, you have a victim, and then you have someone who comes in and solves it by the end. And I think maybe people don't age mystery characters as much sometimes is because you're following that formula kind of in every book, and that's what readers want and that's what readers expect. And maybe some readers like the more personal details and stuff, and maybe some of them don't. But your core story is still solving the mystery and not necessarily how old your character is, unless it ties into that mystery plot somehow.
Mm-hmm.
For fantasy, I think fantasy, it's like, it also kind of falls into that same plot because you have a bad guy, you have the evil empire like in Star Wars or, Klingons on Star Trek or whatever, and then kind of when they're defeated, then that's kind of the end of your story and the end of your book. And maybe it takes a week or a couple of days or a month, but usually it's not like, decades and decades of fighting the same battle over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think part of it is whatever tropes we're working with in whichever genre. So, the quest trope is not usually going to be taken up by a middle-aged person because they don't have that to prove, whereas a young coming-of-age person at a coming-of-age age, they will have something to prove and want to undertake that. In mystery, I think I totally agree. Of course, we want to have really great characters because we want readers to invest their time and be interested. But at the end of the day, it's, what's the crime and who did it, or how did it, or why did it, or whatever it might be. And I think I also personally don't want to be presumptuous and write an age that I really don't understand. So I don't know what it's like to be 70 yet. So I'm not going to try and write that. If I felt really compelled, I would talk to some relatives who were that age or whatnot, but I don't feel that compulsion yet. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing that factors into, how much I want to age the characters and things like that. Yeah. I know part of the description for this panel said it seemed like for a bit in the 90s, all female PIs and sleuths were in their 30s or something like that. And I wonder if that's not because the women writing those were around that age and they were writing, the age that they were most familiar or comfortable with, and perhaps had the most material for them to work with.
Yeah, I picked that up in the description, and it reminded me of I guess it was like a kind of a call for submissions from Dundurn Press, which publishes a lot of mysteries. And what they're saying here is that they don't want something, they prefer something off the beaten track of aging detectives. So in other words, it's almost like it seems nowadays the cliche or the common thing has been aging detectives, and they're getting too much of that. So that, in terms of marketability, that might be a little factor, right? That's happening.
Yeah, and I think a lot depends on where you start and where you finish. So, I've been working on a mystery series which is set between the wars, and it has in my mind, it has a plan that it will end. It begins in 1918 at the end of the war, and it will end when war breaks out again. And it's the same character, and so he will age those 20 years. But he starts out at 25. Mm-hmm. So when he finishes, he's 45, and I know from experience at 45 you can still do things. 65, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, if you start with a character who's much younger than you, then you'll be ahead of them all the way, probably. Yeah, that's true.
I was just put in mind, I don't know what triggered this, but Laurel K. Hamilton, who writes urban fantasy, paranormal romance, I suppose. Each book might take place over the course of 2 days, and they're 200-300 pages. So she condenses a lot into one of those novels, and her character, whether it's Anita Blake, she has 2 different series, or it's Mary Gentry, they barely age at all. Also, they have supernatural stuff going on, so they're barely aging anyway.
Well, and they're doing a lot of other stuff, too, besides aging.
There are things happening in these books that are very life-affirming. We'll leave it at that.
Tiring.
Or both. Yeah, so, it just depends how, I guess what calls to you, I wouldn't, so with Laurel K. Hamilton, there's a lot of minutia in there as well. You know, all the erotic scenes aside, and all the action scenes aside, there's a lot of minutia in that, and she fills each book with that, so that it's sometimes at the end of the book you realize that was just one day. Oh my God!
Thought just came to me is that part of the struggle about dealing with the whole life of a character comes from the fact we no longer write an omniscient point of view. That sort of disappeared, just before World War II. Because if you go back and read the Sherlock Holmes stories, they constantly are referring to his retirement, and the fact that he's going to go keep bees and, do these things, because it's written essentially, John Watson taking an omniscient point of view, knowing things he couldn't possibly know as he narrates the story. So they deal with it that way, that, Sherlock Holmes doesn't actually get any older in the course of all those stories, but we do know, how his life progresses from beginning to end, because we get just told it. But we can't do that anymore, because, it's, I don't know why. I read some omniscient fiction recently, which I really liked, so maybe it'll come back, and then we won't have to worry about this.
You've just put me in mind of Laurie R. King's series, the Mary Russell series, in which Sherlock Holmes is retired and is keeping bees on the Sussex Downs. And Mary is actually the narration character, the POV character, is first person. And she ages from 15-year-old to, I believe, she's 24 currently, and I think it's 9 or 10 books in. So, and it takes place, I think, 1922?
Somewhere around there.
Maybe it starts, or maybe 1919. So, and there you see how she writes Holmes aging and what he can and cannot do, or he can still do a lot for someone who's 60.
Much older than 60.
Yeah.
In those books, he's in his 70s,
yes.
well into his 70s.
Yeah, but he's really feeling it now.
Yeah.
So he can still do all this stuff, but he's really feeling it.
Yeah.
And I suppose this shift from omniscient to writing in the more intimate point of view might, it's all tied in with wanting to get more into the sleuth character rather than just the mystery, I guess. So it all comes, it's all part of that whole thing. And then aging, because we all age and we're all impacted by what happened in the last mystery. Like if you've gone through a horrible crime, you want to know the impact of it on your character, as he maybe is only a few months older, but what happens in the previous book impacts the character in the next book and that, and whereas it didn't in the past stories. And it's just part of this modern change.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we may avoid dealing with in mysteries, what you just brought up, and in fantasy, where there's a tremendous amount of violence, that does change people, and
in real life,
in real life, and
Yeah.
it sometimes bothers me when I see characters who either perpetrate or witness terrible acts of violence, and it has no psychological effect on them. They just go on, da 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 da. My life is the same. Whereas in fact, most people who experience that wind up, with a serious problems: post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, flashbacks, all that kind of stuff. And we very seldom see that kind of realism, except maybe in some noir detective stuff where all of the characters are broken and just struggling to get from one day to the next.
Although I think some
usually
are
with bourbon.
some are trying to do that. Some, I think,
Yeah.
particular series. I've heard the intimate point of view thing too. I don't know. I'm jumping back to that, but came from movies, because in movies there's always a point of view, and we've kind of been trained to think that way. Maybe.
Well, the movies are omniscient because it's the director's point of view.
But you're usually kind of from a character's point of view too, though, aren't you, in a movie? I don't know.
Well, some things. Scrubs was shot from a point of view character.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're getting off the track.
Yeah.
So I don't have any more questions. Do you have any questions for each other?
Not really. We can
Well,
always
I
open
do.
it
I
up.
do.
Oh, you do?
What is your maybe your favorite thing about aging your character, or your least favorite thing about aging your character? Everyone's thinking.
I'm thinking, well, like I said, I get the why aren't they engaged, why aren't they married, why aren't they having kids yet question all the time. And it's like in the book, she's only 31 anyway. So it's like she's still got plenty of time for all that. But like I said, I've been writing it for 7 years now, and it'll probably go on a couple more years as I finish it out. And it's just like you just kind of have to keep reminding people that not actually that much time has passed.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of my thing.
I would say from my own point of view is by aging my characters, and I draw heavily on personal experience, as we all do. My characters get to deal with problems better than I did, and so that's kind of cathartic in a way. I mean, it's nice to go back through all those relationship issues that didn't work out, and that you now know why they didn't work out, or career issues that didn't work out, and you can actually have your character confront parallel events, not necessarily the same events, but parallel events, and actually have the wisdom of experience to go back and say, no, you dummy, don't do it that way, do it this way. So I like that. I like to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, I think it's just what I probably said is that it just feels like more like a real person who's going on in her life and things happening, and that would be the positive. And the negative is just trying to fit it in with publishing in my own writing time frame of getting it done in a reasonable amount of time. Because I did have one publisher say that people don't like large gaps in your character's life. But at the same time, there seems to be large gaps in her publishing life.
Right.
So, yeah.
In your publishing life.
Yes.
Yeah. If I may answer my own question.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I really enjoy delving into how my character Lola deals with trauma. I'm just really interested in that without devolving into a psychological drama, because I'm not interested in that. But just how we all have traumatic things that happen to us throughout our lives, but how we all put on this face so that we can continue everyday life as though we're fine. And I like seeing how she'll be doing that, because I'm still discovering it too for myself with her. And I can think, so in this beginning of the series, she's 28. I mean, that is so young. Mm-hmm. And I'm also planning ahead and looking forward to how she's going to be at 34, 35, or even 38, dealing with these things that happened to her at 28. So I like that aspect of aging a character very much. My least favorite is keeping track of all the minutiae.
Yeah.
And the question of, is she going to be married and have children? I don't know. She doesn't know.
She's 28.
Yeah. I mean, she's divorced once, but come on. Plenty of life ahead of her. Yeah.
All right. So are there questions from the audience? Yes.
First of all, I'd like to thank you all for having providing excellent examples that pertain to the writing area of this topic, because quite often we end up with only movie references, so all of those series references you made were really good. I'd like to hear some comments about not aging your character at all, leaving them in a timeless state, and whether that ties into this whole concept of youth now in the world that we seem to be focused on, and health and fitness, and is that something that is current to this publishing area, or as one of you mentioned, that the publisher's looking for doesn't want aging detectives anymore. So just talk about maybe why we seem to be like a lot of things that are ageless in some ways.
Well, I think we've thrown out some examples of where that happens.
Should repeat that.
Oh yes, right.
Recording,
Repeat the question. So the question is, what about characters who seem ageless? Is there pressure now from publishers to actually keep characters essentially the same age as a series goes on? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing that, and how do you deal with it, I guess? I think there's some really interesting things happen. I mean, we talk about Sue Grafton's books. I mean, I wouldn't want to live in that neighborhood, frankly, because year passes, there's been 26 murders. So there's a kind of unreality, artificial, and it does come down to this issue of, is the story about the character or is the story about the plot, right? So if the story is primarily about the plot, you can actually get away quite easily with an unaging character, essentially timeless. It all occurs within the same time frame. And I think, when you move to the other end of that writing spectrum of character, it's really hard not to have characters age. So John MacDonald was very interested in that process of how does a rogue turn into an old man, right? So Travis McGee does that, and it's very meticulously done, right? So could the Travis McGee stories be published today, be sold today? I don't know, maybe not. But I do have to go back to Nero Wolfe very briefly. The fact that Nero Wolfe never ages, even though time passes, allowed Rex Stout, who began his life as a very good literary writer, to do some really funny things. So there's one of the early books, Rex Stout goes and he's dealing with this kitchen. It's in the 30s, and there's all the staff in the kitchen are black. And of course, they're treated very badly, and Nero Wolfe is a civil libertarian, as Rex Stout was even in the 30s and 40s. So anyway, it gets resolved. 40 years later, or 30 years later, in the 1960s, one of the characters, now grown up with children, comes to Nero Wolfe to solve a problem because he's mad his daughter is going to marry a white man, right? So Nero Wolfe basically let characters from an earlier book age, but Nero Wolfe stays the same age, right? And it was a fascinating. It was one of the best books because it actually allowed Rex Stout to cut deeply into the issue of American civil rights, and just in a little mystery, right? So that's an example. Again, I'm not sure that Rex Stout could get published in today's publishing world either. So that's just my random thoughts on that. But go ahead.
Well, I would say too, and I'm going to use a TV and a movie reference now because you brought that up. Sometimes, like you were talking about, is it more about the plot or is it more about the character? But sometimes those two things are so interwoven, like take Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Veronica Mars. When those TV shows start out, they're both set in high school. But, as the years pass, they age the characters out of high school and they go on to college and stuff. But then, this is my personal opinion, but a lot of the times when they leave high school and they go to college, the shows aren't so good anymore because they've changed kind of the original dynamic of the show. So that's something you have to think about too, like what do you want your dynamic to be? Do you want to tell a mystery story all the time? Do you want it more about the character? Do you want the dynamic where the two kind of coexist and commingle? And then and you were talking about Rex Stout and kind of the social commentary. It's interesting for me. One of my favorite authors is Donald Westlake, also Richard Stark. And as Richard Stark, he has a series about a thief named Parker, and I think he started writing those maybe in the 60s. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But, he uses a lot of language that we would not use today, in reference to social groups and women and all that sort of thing. But Parker himself never really seems to age, although he kills all the other characters in the books, so maybe that's the reason. But it's interesting to read those books from the 60s and 70s and the earlier time periods, and then have the same character today in the modern setting, and just how the language and some of the social norms have changed.
Yeah, those are all really good comments. I guess we'll just finish this question first. What I was going to say, I think like Hayden said, it really depends on what your book is really strong about, and if it's really strong on the police procedural and the mystery and the plot, then maybe you don't need to age your character that much, although you still bring in personal details to give him or her personality. There could be that. But whereas if your story it's almost more a personal story reading, that people are reading more for the characters and sort of incidentally the murder, even though that's driving the story. There are a lot of writers like that people really want to know more about the character. Then the aging thing probably works the best. So I think it really depends on where the strength of the movie, to use an example that's both a book and a movie, the Da Vinci Code, that's really strong on plot and the art and the history. We don't really care about the character all that much, so we don't really care how he develops, and that's just not the book's strength, and it works. So whatever works. And to comment on Rex Stout, who I haven't read those books, but you could probably even today, if your interest was, you could keep a character the same and age the time and show how a character from a previous era kind of responds to it. That could be something interesting to play with too. So that could even work. Maybe that's what Rex Stout was really good at, was showing a time period, and that maybe he could be published today if he tweaked it a little.
Yeah. So another American author, Carol O'Connell, she writes a series that's the Mallory series, and the main character is Kathy Mallory, who is essentially a psychopath with a badge. No, a sociopath, I should say. And so she doesn't actually really change. And most of the character-driven action has to do with her really resolving her childhood, which was traumatic for a number of reasons. And the people around her, they're minor characters, but they usually play a major part in her life. They don't really seem to age that much. There's a lot of mention of them being old, because they are. But really, they don't change that much. And this series still manages to be quite gripping, you know, on the emotional level as well as, you know, at the level of plot. So I think that's a neat series to check out if you're interested in that.
And one series, 43 or 44 books and counting, with the same characters, would be the J.D. Robb series.
Oh, gosh,
You know,
yes.
Nora Roberts, the
In Death.
In Death. They all have death in the title, yeah.
That's a great example.
So there was another question. Someone else had it. Yes.
Well, actually, when you were speaking about your world not aging, but it's time period aging, I just wondered if there's that aspect of superhero to somebody's, almost like a superhero character, you know, where they would have powers. I mean, not intentionally, but they often go in that way. But to me, some of the detectives in mystery series are almost like superheroes. You know, kids in emotion. I'm sure they've been killed several times, but they just survive. Right?
So the question is this issue of aging sometimes have to do with the characters, you know, in mysteries or fantasies in series, sort of being superhuman, be like superheroes, and they therefore sort of live in a different, I guess, time speed than the rest of us, and they can continue to do things more exceptionally than others. So is that
Yeah, no, it wasn't really the question. It was just kind of a comment.
okay?
It just occurred to me when you were saying that they are, some of them are almost like superhero.
Well, I would think one of the best examples of that would be Jack Reacher by Lee Child, because he's survived a lot of stuff at this point, like 14, 15 books and counting. And then part of it, too, is like the business side for the author. If you kill your main character off, then you've killed your income off. And I know my character, 16 books, she should have been dead like at the end of book 1.
Yeah.
But, you know, I have a background in journalism, and I think it was one of my journalism professors told me, you know, only trouble is interesting to read about. And that's kind of the mantra, I think, for all books. You know, there has to be a problem or something of interest, and, you know, maybe your character does need to be a little superhuman to solve it, but we like reading about those larger-than-life characters.
Sorry, yeah, my question was actually, because Susan was saying that you can't relate to the older character, which is understandable if you haven't done that. But if you're an older writer and you're writing about a younger character, you've got that background, but do you find it difficult to kind of relate to that younger character? And there's also, what would you call it, just keeping up. I mean, I read some mysteries that are written by perhaps an older author about a younger character, and they don't really listen to the kind of music or use the figurative expressions that are used now.
Yeah.
I think that's just something that, I mean, I like it, I still read it, I enjoy it, but that part of it isn't authentic to me.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
I have to repeat the question.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, yeah.
So the question is, you know, maybe it's difficult for a younger writer to relate or write about an older character, but is the same issue for an older writer to write about a younger character because they don't necessarily relate to the cultural influences and the experiences of that younger person? So.
Yeah, I think that's exactly true, because my cultural touchstones are certain things. So in my 20s, certain things were going on culturally in the world, and it's just almost second nature to me to think about it. In my 30s, something else was going on, the music, the political situation, world events. And so it's almost like second nature if you're doing a character your own age. But I think if I was doing a character, significantly younger, which I have done, like 20, 30 years, I almost have to research that. Like, what were the big songs at the time? What were the kind of philosophies? What was going on in the world? And it almost A lot of writers I find sort of get away with it by they having their character have a retro interest, like they seem to have I find I encounter a lot of youngish characters who have an interest in 60s music, or just probably because the author is older. And I think it's just good. I would think it's kind of nice to just go that extra distance and research it and listen to the later get more into how a character really would be in that really time frame. But I agree, it takes more research because of those cultural references, I would say.
I don't know if this is appropriate when I'm bringing it up. Anyway, there's someone who puts out a list every year. It's sort of addressed to the graduating class of, and it's like 18 years in the future. You will not know, and there was a huge list of all the cultural touch points that those 18-year-olds will not know, the ones who were born now. Mm-hmm. And it's shocking.
Or like, people born today will never live without cell phones. I can remember when we didn't have cell phones, when I didn't have a computer, when we didn't have air conditioning, but like everybody born today.
I can remember when we didn't have calculators.
Yeah.
Slide rules.
Or microwaves, or all sorts of things. Yeah. You're right.
Yeah. I think actually the point that Susan brought up is that we would never really ask this question when we were writing about a character set in 1880, right? Because how would you know what it's like? No one alive is writing about characters set in 1880. You research it. You have to research it. So if you want to write about a character who listens to hip hop, guess what? You got to listen to hip hop. That's the price you have to pay.
Oh, come on.
Does the age of your reader affect how you age the characters? Because you have the Harry Potter series where each one came out in September, 1 year apart, and was one school year long. So the readers aged with the characters, as opposed to the adult mystery series that you guys are talking about.
Sure. So the question is, does the age of the reader affect how the character is aged? So the example being Harry Potter, where he aged a year with each book, and so his cohort of fans would move along the same way. Is that different? So I guess particularly for young adult fiction and so on.
Well, I write quite a bit of YA fiction, and I have a 6-book series, and it took place over the course of about 6 months. Again, I guess I just like the 1 month, 1 book kind of a thing. But you do think about that a little bit, like she's 17 through the whole course of the series. And the books came out fairly quickly. I think the whole series was out within like 2 or 3 years. So you also have to consider like how long is it going to take for your publisher to put out the books, and how long do you want to write the books, and that sort of thing. YA is kind of tricky though, because so many adults read it now. So yeah, you can do kind of the J.K. Rowling pattern and do 1 year, 1 book. But then, your adult readers aren't really going to care about that so much. So it really just depends on what you think will work best for your story and what you want to keep track of as an author.
Yeah, it probably does matter more for YA readers, I suppose, because there is a big difference between 10 and 12. And once you get into adulthood, maybe there's not a huge difference between 40, 50, 60. So maybe your readers wouldn't really care that much, if the character is right precisely 52 or 58 or exactly that age. So it may becomes less important, I would guess.
I mean, there are people who tell you there's a formula that if you're writing for 14-year-olds, your character should be 16. It's because kids want they want to know what it's going to be like, because it's a very changeable period of your life. But on the other end of it, I'd say on a personal note, I read more and more literary fiction as I get older. And the main reason is that I get tired of reading about young people. I begin to want to read about people who have, been through the mill of life and who have different, more mature or, whatever, perspectives on the way things is. And you don't find very much of that. I mean, you can find it occasionally in genre fiction, but so there is that factor that I think it would be great. I would love to publish a book, where the hero is truly 60 years old, with all the physical limitations of being 60. And don't let anyone tell you it's the new 40, because it's a new 40 if you were a Neanderthal and you died at 42. But
Yeah.
I would love to publish a book like that, a science fiction book like that. But they're very few and far between. It's very hard to find them. The older characters become secondary characters. They move to the background, and the young people take over, which is the way life actually works. But I don't want to see it that way.
Mm-hmm. Because in John fiction, you're doing things, right?
Yeah.
You're out there, and you're almost getting killed in every book, and things.
Yeah, try running
Yeah.
upstairs
Yeah.
when you're 62.
But I think Henning Mankell did it. You could try him.
I'm wondering about supernatural characters. Do any of your supernatural characters recur in your books? And does any of this discussion about aging apply to them?
I have a quick answer to that. Yeah, I have seen that. And the best thing that happens is that they don't age, but they suffer enormous amount as the people that they love die, right? So some of the immortal stories are really, the character elements and the change that occurs in the immortal character, because characters who don't ever change are actually boring as shit. Characters, do experience terrible trauma. Even if they don't age, they lose people. They have to adapt. So I think I didn't repeat the question, but I think the answer kind of implied what the question was.
Actually, in my books, especially in the Assassin series, I have quite a bit of age range. The heroine, is like in her early 30s, and a lot of her friends are in that age group. But then, her assistant is like in his 50s, and then she has like what I would consider like her mentor /father figure was in his 70s, and then she has kind of a grandmotherly figure who is a dwarf. So I made her like 250 years old, and I try to give them like the dwarven character. I kind of based it on my old grandmother with every time that Jen, my character, needs her, she'll come to the door in her house coat with the pink sponge rollers in her hair because that's what my grandma does. So it's not necessarily, I think, about them being supernatural or not. It's just kind of about, I guess, the traits matching their age or, what we have experienced of people of that age, like me with my grandmother.
And my series protagonist is decidedly not supernatural, and that was by choice because it just makes difficulties that much more interesting to write. But she does have a ghost, and ghosts in my world, they don't age. You're dead, you become a ghost, and you're ageless. You can no longer exist as a ghost, but you don't age. But they still learn and grow with experience. So there's that lovely part of it without worrying about, what a 100-year-old ghost is like. They're just the same age they were when they died. So I don't think I think it just depends on the writer, how you want your supernatural characters to age or not and what you want to do with it. I can definitely see a lot of potential for a lot of fun in that, like with a 250-year-old dwarf grandma. I love that. I love the idea of that.
Okay, I'm told that time is up. So if we each have like a 30-second final comment. Anyone?
As with anything with writing, experiment and see what works and doesn't work. Do a lot of reading, see what works and doesn't work.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think whatever you, after you're reading and you're trying things out, whatever you come down with, you could probably make it work, whether they're aging or whether they're not, because both are out there, even in today's writing.
I would just say have fun with your writing, as much fun as you can have with writing, because nobody else is going to write your book for you.
Yeah, yeah. There are no real rules, but if there were rules, if you write well enough, you can break them.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.